We're now live.
Excellent. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest webinar in the ARM Cell and Gene webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about value-based payments, value-based payments 101, to try to give the audience a sense of value-based payments and the role they're going to play in access to cell and gene therapies going forward. I'm Janet Lambert. I'm the CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and we have a terrific group of panelists to talk about this topic with you today. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of introductory remarks, both about ARM, but then to set up the topic for our conversation with the panelists. ARM, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Alliance, is an international advocacy organization focused on bringing the promise of safe and effective regenerative medicines to reality for patients around the world. In our lexicon, cell and gene therapy and tissue engineering make up regenerative medicine. ARM has 350 members around the world across 25 countries. Those members are companies, research institutions, patient organizations, and other stakeholders. Our focus is really on those things that can help the whole sector move forward, and that includes clear regulatory pathways for cell and gene therapies, market access and reimbursement policies that can support the delivery of these new medicines. We focus on trying to address industrialization and manufacturing hurdles in this space. And then we also compile quite a bit of sector data to educate the media and other stakeholders about the sector. ARM has a number of resources that are available to members and non-members alike. We have this Cell and Gene webinar series. Past webinars are available on our website. We've built out a new COVID-19 resource library that is specific to cell and gene therapy and touches in particular on, for example, regulatory updates that have been made in the wake of changes to clinical trials in the midst of the pandemic. We have quite a lot of sector data and policy analyses specific to this state available, specific to this sector available on the website. And we have a weekly newsletter that provides updates on clinical developments, policy developments, business developments, and the like for the regenerative medicine sector. And that's available to anyone who's interested in receiving it weekly. The next webinar in this series will focus on the next wave of commercial development. Obviously, we've had a number of cell and gene therapies come to market in the US and Europe over the last couple of years. There's a very full pipeline and a number of additional products are expected to come to market soon. So some key representatives from those companies bringing the next generation of products to market will come together on Friday, June 19th. We invite you to join us. So today I have the pleasure of teaming up with the Every Life Foundation for Rare Disease to put this webinar together. As I mentioned, I'm going to just make a few introductory remarks to set up the topic. Then we're going to have a moderated discussion from about 12:10 to 12:45. And then we'll look forward to taking your questions at that point. I would ask you as a housekeeping matter to put your questions into the Q&A function of Zoom. Please don't use the chat. We won't be looking for questions on the chat, but we will be drawing questions from the Q&A. So to just introduce this topic a little bit, since we've described this as a gene therapy 101, we anticipate that those of you who have dialed in have different degrees of familiarity with these topics. So let me just start by saying that cell and gene therapies have really the potential to have a profound and durable response for patients, often with just a single administration. And that is the basis for a lot of the conversation we're going to have today. These therapies kind of go by different terms depending upon regions and organizations. Again, they're sometimes called regenerative medicines, sometimes cell and gene therapies. In the ACER context, they're called SSTs, or single or short-term therapies. In Europe, they tend to be referred to as ATMPs, or advanced therapy. I think it's medicinal products, actually. Gene therapy are those therapies that seek to modify or introduce genes in a patient's body in order to correct a mutation or provide a therapeutic benefit. Cell therapy tends to focus on the administration of cells into a patient's body to grow, replace, or repair damaged tissues or cells. These therapies, in some indications, can provide significant cost savings to the healthcare system over time, and ARM has done some analysis around blood disorders that support that conclusion. But the reality is there are high upfront costs to many of these therapies, and that those upfront costs do create a burden on existing reimbursement systems, and that is part of the motivation behind new payment models. I mentioned this sort of profound benefit, and this chart is really just a reflection of that. These are the first cell and gene therapies, modern cell and gene therapies, to come to market in the US and Europe. As you can see, they're about the bottom two are cell therapies, the top three are gene therapies. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the response rates in the right-hand column. You can see that these therapies are not providing, small incremental benefits to a small portion of patients. These therapies have traditionally in these trials been delivered to patients who, in many cases, have not responded to previous treatments, but have in fact shown a remarkable response to the cell and gene therapy. And in significant cases, the number of patients, the percentage of patients treated who have shown a significant response is really outstanding. So this is just to reflect the kind of core point that this is a new category of medicines that has special qualities, so far a really dramatic impact on patients. And so it motivates us all to think about how do we address outstanding issues that stand between the scientific progress around developing these products and actually getting them to patients. So what are value-based payment models? So traditional reimbursement systems utilize a fee-for-service model based on generally the quantity of service provided. Value-based approaches focus on the quality of the care and the effectiveness of the therapy. Value-based models include, but aren't limited to, annuity models that allow payers to spread the cost of a therapy over a long period of time, even if they're single administration. They also include outcomes-based models, which link the payment to some clinical, pre-agreed upon clinical outcome. And in that way, the manufacturer shares the risk with the provider and the patient. There are currently a number of barriers to value-based payment models, and these could limit patient access to innovative therapies. And that's really what we want to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, or rather ask them to introduce themselves. First, Annie Kennedy. Would you like to say hello, Annie?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Annie Kennedy, and the Every Life Foundation is delighted to be partnering with ARM for this session today. We are an organization that's focused on empowering the patient community to drive impactful science-driven legislation and policy that enhances the advancement of treatments, diagnostic opportunities, and access. So we're delighted to be a part of this conversation today. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Annie. Next, Lauren Nelson, who's the Director of National Accounts at Avexis. you like to say hello, Lauren?
I'm Lauren Nelson. I'm Director of National Accounts with Avexis, which is a Novartis company. And, we are the manufacturers of Zolgensma, which, Janet, I think you talked briefly about a moment ago. My background has been, I think, on the commercial side, mainly of the industry, mainly in sales, consulting, and access. And we're pleased as well to partner with ARM on this. Worked with the organization for the past few years, and have been very optimistic about the developments in the space. So thank you for hosting today's discussion.
Thank you. Michael Sherman, the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes, hi. It's Michael Sherman. Great to be with all of you today, if virtually. I'm from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, which is a 1.2 million member regional health plan in New England. We also have an institute which includes the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And we really think it's important to make sure that we provide access to these transformative therapies, and that the initial price tag, while it may introduce some sticker shock, shouldn't be a reason not to cover them. So some payers have a fairly or unfairly reputation for looking for reasons to say no. When you look at the impact of these therapeutics on the patients who so much need them, it becomes clear that we need to be finding ways to say yes. And that's why I really enjoy the opportunity to engage with all these groups, whether it is Avexis, the MIT New Digs folks, and all the other stakeholders out there.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm sorry I garbled your title. They were getting me off the screen share at the moment you started talking, and I lost a word or two. So my apologies for that. Last, I'd like to give Mark Trusheim from the MIT New Digs Project a chance to say hello and introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Trusheim, as Janet just said, from MIT New Digs Initiative, where we bring together large consortiums to advance biomedical innovation, particularly for patients, but for the whole community. One of our projects is called Financing of Cures in the US, which has the clever acronym of FOCUS, where we've been working for about 3 years with all the organizations on this webinar, as well as about 100 others, to address the financial challenges that cell and gene therapies bring to the whole healthcare system, particularly, as Janet pointed out, for the access of patients to these dynamic, transformative scientific advances.
So thanks, everybody. I'm really excited about the conversation and all the expertise that you all bring to it. So Mark, let me start with you, because I know you've done a lot of work, kind of analytical work in this space from your approach at MIT. I talked a little bit about, what a value-based payment model is, but could you talk a little bit to set this stage about, are these really brand new? Are value-based payments brand new to cell and gene therapy, or have they been used before? And if so, what makes them sort of particularly important in cell and gene therapy?
Sure, thanks, Janet. You did a wonderful job of, as you always do, of setting up the conversation. So thank you. The value-based arrangements, agreements, outcomes-based contracts, subscription models, a variety of different terms have been used for a decade or more, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States. But cell and gene therapies are particularly matched to these value-based agreements for a couple reasons. First, that uncertainty of which patients are going to respond and for how long, and which are the right populations that will really surface that require these are pretty large in this space compared to cardiovascular drugs that have 10,000 person trials, and there's much less uncertainty about them. And value-based agreements are really about managing uncertainties and helping people manage through those. There are 3 particular uncertainties that cell and gene therapies, particularly the durable ones, present. One is the performance-based uncertainty, which Janet described. The second is payment timing, that you wind up paying all up front for benefits that are received over multiple years. So it would be nice to spread those out. And there's a third risk, which is around the actuarial numbers of how many patients might appear in a particular payer's population, because many of these are very rare. And so a fairly expensive therapy can have a reasonably dramatic income effect for smaller payers, whether it be self-insured employers, even small regional plans, where that kind of volatility of not knowing when a patient might come into that population is important to try to manage through. So those three approaches, performance-based, the payment timing, and the actuarial risk, are all accentuated in this particular product category. And there's a variety of tools that you mentioned, Janet, as well as subscription models, are known as the Netflix models. There's some warranty model approaches that have been proposed. So it's really quite a broad set of tools, which we at Newdigs call precision financing. So you can match the particular financing tool with the particular product type and the payer segment, because different payers have different concerns and also different restrictions on what they might be able to contract under. With that, I think that's a good first step. Janet, did you want to take it on to the next piece?
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's a good segue. Let me ask Michael, since you're the one who actually sits inside of a clinical center, treating patients and seeing patients. What Mark described was kind of all these financial details about how things could be structured. But from your perspective, Harvard Pilgrim has been really open to the adoption of these value-based contracting models. Can you describe why and what impact they've had in your world?
Yes. So first, in general, everyone agrees that fee-for-service is a bad recipe for value. And for our providers, about 75% earn some type of value-based agreement that is tied to something other than volume. When we started looking at our drug costs closely a couple of years ago, we noticed, first of all, that 1 out of every $4 we spent was on drugs, whether pharmacy or medical benefit. And again, there are debates out there, but I will say in a commercial population, I have data and I know what we spend. So, that was pretty clear. That doesn't in itself mean anything good or bad. If we see more transformational therapies that save lives, improve quality of life, and keep people out of hospitals and clinics, maybe that should be 30 or 35%. But we did notice that for certain types of therapeutics, we were seeing increases that were disproportionate to the benefit that patients were receiving. And this was even before any of the cell and gene therapies came out. So I went out there and started pushing the pharma industry to engage in value-based agreements. And frankly, I got a lot of, we can't do that, we don't know how to. And I would raise my hand and say, well, you figured this out in other countries where, where they told you had to figure it out. Why can't we try that here? And our first break came actually about 3 or 4 years ago with the PCSK9s, in large part because there were 2 that came out pretty close to one another. And again, if you think about what Mark said earlier, they fit many of the criteria. We would be long-term benefits. We were worried about it being a significant budget impact, and there were concerns about access on the part of the manufacturers. And that, again, this was with payers having what I would call a Hep C hangover. So we were probably more concerned about the budget impact than we would have been. So bottom line is, since then, we've engaged in many of these. We've shown that we can execute on them. But that said, when you look upon where we need these the most, because there is work involved in executing them on many people's parts, it really is with the high-cost therapeutics like cell and gene therapy, where you have a high nominal cost, which again may be justified, but it's still challenging to pay for. And again, I won't rehash everything Mark said because he summarized it so well. But for all of those reasons, the uncertainty, we need some way to balance access and affordability and to make sure that we're getting value for our money. I'd also remind everyone that when you talk about commercial populations, that means for the most part, employers. Exchanges are a relatively small percentage. And the majority of our employers are actually now self-insured. And even for those fully insured, if costs go up a lot, it comes back next year in the way of premiums. So when you see that there are tens of millions of newly unemployed individuals who may go on to Medicaid or exchanges or other products or otherwise have less robust coverage, and you see employers suffering in general, it means there's additional pressure on payers and questions about why we're covering these therapeutics. If you think about what goes into determining the upfront cost, again, a lifetime of cure, we often don't have a lifetime's worth of data, speaks the uncertainty Mark addressed. In many cases, we're also seeing the FDA grant approval with what many of us would call imperfect and less than robust data. And there's good reasons for this in many cases. You've got patients who are suffering with no cure in sight. In many of these cases, for the ultra-rare conditions particularly, it's really hard to do well-controlled clinical trials, et cetera. So that's understandable. But when these drugs are approved, it also means that there's expectations on the part of individuals, members, families, physicians, others that will cover them to FDA label. And we've also seen cases, and there's a number of these out there we could chat about, where the FDA approval has been broader than the population studied. So particularly when you have a high upfront price tag, many payers respond kind of knee-jerk with, that's interesting, come back when you have data, we're not going to cover it for that expanded population, even if FDA approved, because you haven't shown it works. That obviously leads to a lot of discord, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the concern on my part is that the patients who need these may have access challenges. So these kind of agreements provide a way not to agree upfront about the value and determine a way to align the payment with the results going forward.
Yeah. So Annie, you've got a particular perspective here. Could you talk about what EveryLife's interest in value-based payments is and why you and your organization think they're important?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for some context, so I'm here representing the broader rare disease community, but I've also had a pretty deep background specifically in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and SMA and some of the communities that have done a lot of the legislative regulatory access work in some of these spaces. And so just to provide, I love being on panels like this and working with some of these partners, because I think there are a lot of layers to the experiences that we're talking about. So I think it would just help for everyone who's on this call to level set just a little bit for our audience, because patients and patient communities, we've had a shift that we're no longer just the end users, but patient communities have become fully engaged citizen scientists is the term that I like to use. And that throughout the product development lifecycle for all of these products that we're talking about, many patient communities are really serving as the catalysts in developing policies, but also many of the products that we're talking about here today. We've worked to inform the development of these products, funding many of these products from the very beginning, actually providing data collection, and also working on the approvals and informing the approvals that have happened. And now that's really evolved into serving to help inform some of the decision-making in the access environment. So many groups have patient registries, have published guidances, have PROs and natural history studies, have refined ICD codes, and have identified opportunities to enhance regulatory infrastructure. But what happened was there was this myth, and many of us believed that once a product was approved, access would come, and that we didn't need to worry about access, especially when it came to products within the rare disease space. And that was indeed not the case. And that was probably had to do with the fact that there weren't as many products being developed in rare diseases. But we spent a lot of time focusing on the traditional chevron that started with preclinical to the end of a phase 3 and approval. And many of us worked with policymakers to develop expedited pathways. And it reflects some of what Michael was just speaking about. There are now pathways that create shorter trials that really address some of the issues in rare diseases where there are fewer patients with huge unmet needs in the communities. And so there are smaller trials, and there is the ability to approve a product that is approved on a surrogate endpoint or surrogate biomarker. But what happens is it's not that there's less rigor in that approval, it's that there's less clinical data once that product is approved. And where that has hurt the patient community is that there is not the data available to the payers needed to inform the decision-making that the payers needed. So there's been a lot of focus on what would inform the decision-making of the regulator, but once products were approved, the payers didn't have the information they needed to inform their decision-making. So there's been a real shift on the part of the patient community and part of others to better understand what payers need to inform payer decision-making. And so those same practices of collaboration and integration of patient experience and understanding what outcomes and what types of data we needed to be collecting all along and working with our industry partners to collect all along throughout therapy development has now begun to shift into those engagements we're having with payers. And so what I love about being a part of this conversation today is that in terms of the products that we're talking about here, for which value-based arrangements and value-based contracts will apply, much of those collaborations and discussions are happening between payers and the developers, which is incredibly important. But it's very important for the patient community that the patient community also be a part of those engagements, because we do have access to so much of that data that could be used to inform the outcomes upon which those values will be based. And our values, what the patient community depends on to survive and thrive, are what those contracts should be based on. So that's why we're here, and that's why we're engaged, and that's why we're thrilled to be a part of these conversations, and really delighted that this body of work is happening to begin with.
That's so helpful. Thanks, Annie. So that's a good segue to Lauren. Lauren, you have and your colleagues have brought a remarkable product to market and been one of the first to do so. So you have had kind of a unique view to what these conversations with payers really look like and feel like and require in order to reach some sort of agreement that then in turn provides patients with access to a life-changing therapy. So could you talk a little bit about kind of the nature of Zolgensma and what your, how that affected your experience in talking to payers about value-based agreements?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think the emergence of one-time therapies, as has been laid out by some of the other panel members, it's really raised some important questions in terms of how our healthcare system defines the value of treatments and manages access to those types of therapies. The early team at Avexis set out to create an offering for payers that would help address questions about things like durability, and things like, I think, the differences perhaps between the clinical population that was studied and the ultimate label, I think, as Michael pointed out. The goal was to create a dynamic where if the product had not worked for a particular patient, then we would have issued a refund. So we engaged many subject matter experts to help us get as far as we could in realizing that goal under the constraints of the US system. That work continues. Where we landed is in offering, payers outcomes-based agreements of up to 5 years, given our belief in the long-term value of Zolgensma. So essentially, if the outcome occurs during that 5-year period, Avexis will reimburse a percentage of the cost of therapy, all within best price. In doing so, I think we have continued to challenge the existing paradigm about, about how payments for products and therapies in the US are made. And we've been very pleased, to your point, we've been very pleased to date with how I think the payer community has responded to the product and to the approach that was taken. So the other piece that I think is worth mentioning is that we also partnered with a third party to build a pay over time option. So this is an option that is structured over 5 years and helps to ease, I think, some of the short-term budget issues that can arise, especially for, as Mark pointed out, for states, smaller payers, self-insured employers. And there's been a lot of interest in that option, but to date, we haven't necessarily seen anybody exercise that option. So I think that's an important finding that was not perhaps expected given the level of interest, but that's what we've seen so far. So really, it was those two pieces primarily: the outcomes piece and the pay over time piece.
Great, thanks. So I think we've had a pretty good couple of minutes here talking about kind of why people care about these, why they're especially important for one-time therapies that are relatively new to the market, have come with a limited amount of clinical data, a bit of uncertainty, profound impact that has, definitely has value to the patients. But we are in the early days of these. And so we know that it's not been so simple, despite the good experience that Lauren and her colleagues have had at Avexis. It's not an easy road to hoe. Mark, could you kind of elaborate on one or two of the key barriers to the adoption of these value-based payment models?
So thanks very much. Since you're going to limit me to one or two, I'm going to focus on those couple that appeal to us at MIT particularly because they deal with numbers, right? And quantifying things. And so the first one of those is, what are the metrics that you're actually going to use to measure performance? Because it's not as straightforward as one might think. Is it that the patient stays alive, that they have a certain functional status, or that they don't incur other kinds of costs that might have been expected with the disease? These selections of metrics are not straightforward clinically, as Annie talked about. They're not straightforward from a patient viewpoint, that those are not always aligned. And they have to be able to be measured in a timely and straightforward manner, because if it costs a great deal to administer these contracts, then I come from the Midwest, we say the juice just ain't worth the squeeze for doing all this, right? So that's the one part, is the metrics and then the data collection systems behind all that. And then there's a second very mathy thing, if you give me another minute, Janet, which is the fact that the Medicaid best price rules, which were established so that the Medicaid program would get the best deal, or at least a significant discount compared to what the free market was showing on the commercial side. But the rules with how that gets calculated were set up in the 1960s to 80s, presuming everything looked like a cardiovascular drug or a diabetes drug, with thousands and thousands of these and great data. So they never anticipated paying over time, where the first payment could be and is interpreted currently under the statute and the regulations as the total payment. And then if you add something in the second year or the third year, well, you can add it back and ask Medicaid back for all the rebate that you had to pay them on the first one. But that's really cumbersome and at great risk for the companies. And there's two or three of those aspects where the current Medicaid best price program, we want to maintain the spirit, but the current mechanics of how they measure and track these innovative new payment and value-based arrangements just doesn't match, which then highly constrains what companies can do in the commercial sector because of these constraints for the public sector. So surprisingly, there's more flexibility to do innovative things with Medicaid than there is with commercial payers such as Michael Sherman, which seems strange, but that's sort of the situation that we're at today.
So going back to you, Lauren, can you talk about how you navigated, or to what extent those kind of barriers affected your bringing Zolgensma to market, and the diversity of a kind of payer reaction you got? Was everybody as kind of friendly and welcoming as Michael and Michael's organization? What kind of barriers did you run into?
Yeah, so I think first I'll speak to Zolgensma specifically, and then maybe broaden my response a bit, just out of respect for the fact that other, as you pointed out, other types of therapies may face different kinds of hurdles. Overall, we've been very pleased with the response from payers. Most of the policies developed to date are reflective of the label for Zolgensma. The success of the launch, both in terms of I think demand from the provider community as well as access, was driven by a lot of early work, as Annie pointed out, in terms of engaging with different stakeholders in the space. And really, the access is strong. So to date in the US, we've implemented policies that cover approximately 97% of commercial patients, over 50% of Medicaid patients. And likewise, we see the final approval rate for on-label patients is over 99%. So it's worth pointing out here too, though, as I alluded, that Zolgensma has a specific kind of product profile. So not all one-time therapies they face the same kinds of challenges, right? So, other things to think about are whether or not the treatment's going to occur in an inpatient environment, or whether there's going to be a slightly wider distribution in terms of durability or treatment response. And then specifically for Medicaid, I think as Mark pointed out, there is enhanced flexibility around the best price piece, but there's also in many cases the need for a SPA or a state plan amendment if states would like to avail themselves of an outcomes-based arrangement. So, if that's not already in place at launch, or if the SPA that is in place in the state wouldn't necessarily cover the way that your agreement or your desired approach has been laid out, that can be a relatively lengthy process, and it requires approval by CMS for the state to then proceed. So, depending on the therapeutic area that you're in, you could see how there could be kind of some pent-up demand in a prevalent population, for example, upon approval, and then you're kind of needing to work these issues out. So I think there's that that timing piece that could be improved in terms of really facilitating some shared understanding of how to move forward, and some opportunity, some operational flexibility in how we move forward. And then likewise, another consideration that you could see at the state level is actually balanced budget requirements. So there can be a perception that if a state has a balanced budget requirement, that the idea of carrying forward any kind of future financial obligation. So for example, a pay over time arrangement, there could be a perception that might, be misaligned with the state's requirement to balance their budget on a regular basis. So, lots of diverse challenges, and I think that it just underscores the need to continue to work across, many different kinds of stakeholders within the space to create the kind of operational space and flexibility that will foster continued investments in the space. And I think too, all of us who are on this call discussing this, we're all also patients, right? So I think, the work continues, and we all want to see the realization of cures and precision medicine.
Thank you. So Michael, what in your day-to-day job, which are the barriers to value-based payment do you run into most often? What makes it hard in your world to really operationalize these agreements that seem to have so many, sort of benefits at least on the surface?
Well, again, a great question. And although there's a lot of interest, there's reasons we've been able to push this forward, but there are barriers. Operationally, again, our systems, our financing systems, our data management systems, our staffing is not set up for this. So to move forward, as I joke with my pharmacists that, they're, part of their job is to tell me which ideas they can actually figure out and which are too crazy and where I've crossed the line and where they're impossible to do. And on occasion, they actually will tell me, kind of very delicately, and explain to me why what I think is a great idea is just so not going to happen. So, there are many issues. Even talking just yesterday, we had, we're all busy with COVID, but I had 2 meetings yesterday about, about innovative reimbursement arrangements for therapies that are in the pipeline. And, we were chatting about hemophilia and how the fact that some of what are likely to be outcome measures are not things that we would normally easily track. And so I had a dialogue with a couple of my lead pharmacists about what did we need to do in terms of managing data or staffing. And basically I said, here, I understand the issues, I'll address them. We'll make sure we're staffing up anyway. And, so we overcame that, but that's a lot of it. If you're looking at things like, particularly multi-payer agreements with portability, or just when and even without that, when pharma companies want to go beyond doing something with Harvard Pilgrim, we may be an early adopter, but they generally want to do it with as many insurers as possible. That creates often the need for intermediaries, and then there's the whole issue of finding the intermediaries who pays for them, transferring data back and forth. So that adds a level of complexity as well. Mark spoke to the Medicaid best price issue. I would say that is, I think, the largest barrier to substantive agreements, because many payers would argue that with that as a constraint over how much risk an Avexis or other companies can go at, the juice may not be worth the squeeze. So we might have a 5-year agreement, but it doesn't mean that if it stops producing after 2 years, we get 60% of our money back because of the best price issues. There's also the question around starting price. Again, we're not going to solve that here, but more and more it's important to show the world that we're negotiating off of a starting price that is fair and reasonable for all parties, including the pharma industry, which understandably has high cost of capital for early stage research in this area, and we don't want to cut off the flow of funds for future innovations. So all that goes into the mix. Some of the other things, though, there are sometimes surprises about populations covered with the FDA label. And although in theory that's good for patients, what happens is you frequently see payers come out with different policies. And when you have gene therapies, and adverse selection is a barrier not only to innovative payment, but to payment in general. But when you have certain payers come out and say out of the box, we're not covering it for this subset of the population, it creates a huge penalty for anyone who chooses to do so, because of the idea that individuals can then sign up for a policy on an exchange if their employer doesn't have that insurer, paying a few $100s a month and take out millions of dollars in value. Again, it may work for that individual. It doesn't work in producing a sustainable system. And then one final issue, which has turned out actually to be more complex than some might imagine. It's a question of outcome measures. So great, we have an agreement, and great that there is a sufficient amount of risk, and great that the drug is priced fairly. How do we determine if the drug has passed or failed for purposes of aligning payments? And that sometimes is, again, more contentious than you might imagine. The payers generally are looking to have more risk, many of the pharma companies less so. And I particularly, and other payers, get frustrated when pharma companies use data elements for FDA approval and then are unwilling to put them into the risk agreement for purpose of defining success or failure with respect to the value-based piece. So that's something which is also enormously complicating, and frankly, I've seen has dissuaded some payers, not us, but some payers, from engaging in these kind of agreements.
So Annie, this issue of metrics and, what are we measuring in an outcomes-based agreement? What clinical outcomes are we going to look at? And means, if we're talking about a 5-year agreement, essentially the patient is a fundamental party to this agreement, right? That they need to be agreeing, presumably on what the metrics need to be relevant to them, but also they need to participate in the process of the ongoing tracking. Talk to me about the role of the patient in all of this, and from your perspective and a patient's perspective, what are the toughest barriers to the implementation of these value-based agreements?
Yeah, I think this is I think where the rubber meets the road. I actually participated in a meeting that NEHI convened in December, where we were beginning to really dig into this. And actually in Duchenne, we convened a meeting a year ago, May, where this had really come up and been a really big issue in Duchenne, as Michael knows, where there had been outcomes that had been used for regulatory purposes that were very different than the outcomes that we really needed to inform decision-making within the access environment. And so we convened stakeholders across the ecosystem. We brought together regulators from FDA, we brought payers, we brought HTAs and evaluators, we brought the methodologists that had developed the outcomes in Duchenne. We pulled all the outcomes that were in clinicaltrials.gov, the primary, secondary, tertiary outcomes. We had representatives from the patient community and one representative from each of the industry partners working in Duchenne. And we had a meeting about this topic. And we actually asked people to vote on which outcomes were of most importance across the disease progression model in Duchenne by subset, by your stakeholder role. And we saw big discrepancies between what payers were interested in, what regulators were interested in, what clinicians were interested in. So that's not to say that all these outcomes aren't important, but what it showed us was that there were some outcomes that were of real interest to payers that we hadn't yet validated in that disease area, and we weren't collecting in the clinical trials that we needed to really begin to dig into and take a hard look at. And so one of the things within rare disease that we're very interested in is, could we do something similar within rare disease? Could we come up with a core set of outcomes that could be collected within subsets of rare diseases that would be of interest across stakeholder groups? And what kind of regulatory signal would industry need to invest in the collection of those outcomes? Because I think this question is going to come up again and again and again. And not every rare disease community is going to be able to invest in the development of these outcomes and to pull that all the way through the ecosystem. So I think as these value-based arrangements are becoming more commonplace, which is incredibly important, I think there is a very distinct and important role for patient communities, but it's going to require that we all come together. And what I'm struck by is I think a lot of these contracts are being developed and patient groups that are informing the outcomes that are collected in clinical trials are not at the table for those same conversations when payers and industry are having making those decisions in the payer environment. And so we may have some data and evidence to inform those decisions, but it's not necessarily getting pulled through if those contracts are being determined in isolation outside of the regulatory environment. So I think we have some real opportunities to pull that through, but this is a nascent space. And so I think we're just at the beginning of what we can be learning from one another.
You know, I think one thing that gets, is really evident from our vantage point in ARM and working with stakeholders in this community is how much we're in a onesies, twosies phase of things, right? That each contract is actually a pretty arduous negotiation at this point. There's not a lot of systemic modeling of how to do these things. And I think as we track the pipeline and the number of clinical trials underway and the number of additional cell and gene therapies that we see coming to market, it just adds to our own sense of urgency about trying to work out, kind of gather the collective learning from folks like you and to try to remove some of these barriers so that this can get a little bit more systematized and become not so much of an operational burden on all the parties. Because I think, what we hear over and over again is that it's hard to do, and sometimes it's just not worth it. It's the mechanics of it are too challenging. I think I want to pause here, and Rob, I know you have been gathering up, this is my colleague, Robert Falb, the head of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at ARM, has been looking through the Q&A, and I think he's going to select a couple of questions for the panelists.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. One question, and it's probably for Mark and Michael, is can you talk about reinsurance and pooling as an alternative to the amortization and outcomes-based agreements that have been the topic so far?
I'm sure. Go ahead, Mark.
All right, I'll take the first crack. So, well, stop loss and reinsurers naturally pool already and show that their premiums will cover the costs of these therapies over a certain amount. Unfortunately, most of those contracts are only for a year at a time. And so these issues of spreading payments over time, understanding the uncertainty of durability and outcomes over time aren't well suited for those. But there are some other approaches of pooling that are more suited towards that. We're seeing some of the larger insurance companies are offering specialized carve-out per member per month kinds of fees just to cover this particular product. So there are different pooling approaches, and some of them really combine multi-year approaches with surety of month-to-month or year-to-year pricing for their customers, whether that be self-insured employers or employers, but they're still imperfect and just beginning to evolve and emerge. Michael, you've, I'm sure, been approached by some of these.
We have, yes. So I would second everything Mark said. As usual, he gave a great, eloquent, concise explanation. But I would also add the following observation, though, if in terms of the need here for innovative solutions, such as he touched on. There's a difference between things like SMA or DMD, where you're born with it as a and it's a surprise and it's covered by reinsurance. But I'd remind the audience that reinsurers don't have the same requirements that commercial payers do. And I'm speaking about the fact that we are not able to essentially exclude pre-existing conditions, which is obviously a good thing for the population and which I support. Unfortunately, reinsurers, which tend to be run by financial types, don't have that restriction. So when they look at a population from year to year and they see someone, let's say who's a hemophiliac or a sickle cell patient, and there are many who are who survive obviously for long periods of time, which is also positive, but they know about them, and they would then carve them out of these traditional reinsurance policies. And my concern is that if one of these particularly smaller self-insured employers gets hit by one of these without the access to some of these innovative solutions, it might bankrupt them literally, or B, and more likely, they will try to exclude paying for it through different type of exclusions. And I'd also remind the audience, again, maybe getting a little insurance specific, but one of the reasons that we've seen so many employers move to self-insured over recent years is that they are exempt from many of the mandates and other regulations that are subject to which self-insured or fully insured accounts are subject. So it's really an important area that we need to think about as we think to solve for access.
And then let me try combining two questions or related questions. The first one was, do value-based methods, quote unquote, pencil out best for diseases in children? And the comment was, it seems that the ability to cure a child has the highest value potential. Should this be the starting point for access? And then there was another question that I think is at the other end of the spectrum, is how might a payer attribute change toward high upfront costs if the therapy targets more common diseases, i.e. large patient populations, diabetes, et cetera?
So, well, starting with the with the second question, for chronic diseases, it's a little easier in terms of being used to pay as you go. But I'm not sure I understand the specific point, but we are seeing potential gene therapies for things like AMD, and I think that's going to create an additional degree of conversations around affordability. To the point though about childhood diseases, I think that's empirically correct. We are seeing a lot of the gene therapies focused on incurable childhood diseases because that's a huge area of unmet need. So that makes sense, and frankly, there is mathematically more value in curing a child. On the other hand, there are therapies, some of which are also high cost, innovative, and may involve gene and cell therapy that are targeted to adults. And again, I think that it is as important for those populations as well. One kind of corollary here is that when you're looking at the benefit that accrues to a child, when you're thinking about the starting price, it doesn't mean that the company should try to capture all those years of value. If you look at someone who may have 70 years of life and use different quality numbers, you rapidly come up with very absurd numbers that, if we try to pay for that amount, would create affordability issues for the entire system. So my sense is if you're taking credit, quote unquote, for more than 5 or 10 years in your pricing model, that probably invites a different discussion.
If I could jump in on the cell therapy side, the CAR T therapies in oncology, even ICER has run the numbers showing that they pencil out as being, cost comparable to other forms of expensive oncology therapies, whether that be other immuno-oncology, et cetera. So unfortunately, childhood diseases, sometimes because they're incurable and there's lots you can do for them, they don't actually incur a lot of costs. So from a payer standpoint, sometimes the older patients that have a history of costs that the new therapies are going to reduce actually pencil out or run the numbers in some ways better from just a narrow healthcare system viewpoint. So it's a mixed bag. It depends which condition. That's why we talk about precision financing. This isn't one silver bullet fits all conditions. It's going to be mixing and matching.
Yeah, one of the one other implication, and again, I think Luxturna for RP65 mediated blindness is illustrates this. If you think about this from just a financial perspective as a commercial payer, there's a lot of benefits to that, particularly if it's your child with the diagnosis. Yet, if you think about to whom the benefits accrue, generally they don't accrue to the payer. These aren't expensive to payers, and the patient and the family may be able to work. The child may be able to work eventually. They may need less care at home. In our system, where commercial payers don't pay for those things, the benefits don't accrue to the payer. Nonetheless, it's clearly unethical as a payer to say because of that we're not going to pay for the cost of the drug. So it also means we need to be a little broader in terms of how we think about the landscape of what the costs are and where they go.
Thank you. Janet, I see we're up against the clock, and I know that a few of the panelists have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so I will stop with the questions.
Great. I noticed in the Q&A that there are a couple of questions about payer, sort of specific questions about payer attitudes and so forth, and we've touched on some of that here. But I would call people's attention to the fact that we did last week, I believe, a webinar with 3 payers talking specifically about their coverage, thinking about cell and gene therapies, touching on whether COVID has impacted the way they think about it. Obviously, COVID is creating some strains on state Medicaid budgets, for example. Does that mean it's going to be less likely that they will cover a cell and gene therapy and provide reimbursement for it? So that webinar is available and is recorded if you'd like to dive into that. I do want to thank our panelists. As Rob said, we know that folks have some hard stops at 1 o'clock, so there's a bunch of questions I wish we could have gotten to, but hopefully we've been able to give people a little bit of an introduction, a 101. I think we got into 201, introduction of value-based payments. And I know our membership is really grateful for everybody's time and not only today, but over time, the work on this really important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet and Rob, for everything you do at ARM and for everyone who listened. Thanks.
Likewise. It's been a pleasure.